Autumn 1757. The sun sets over the gentle hills of Saxony, but the horizon is not marked by peace, but by a threatening cloud of dust. 41-0. French and Austrian soldiers march in perfect formation. Their drums hammer the rhythm of certain victory. At their head ride the General Subbies and Hildburghausen, convinced that today they will force the Prussian king to his knees. On the opposite side, behind a low hill, stands Frederick the Great. 22-0 men, that is all he is left. Half the enemy force, his uniform is dusty, his face shows the traces of months of fighting. Through his telescope, he observes the approaching army, and a barely perceptible smile plays on his lips. "Your Majesty, we should retreat," whispers one of his officers nervously. The French superiority is overwhelming. Any rational military strategist would order the retreat, but Frederick is no ordinary strategist. "No," he replies calmly without taking his eyes off the enemy army. "We stay and more. We will destroy them." The officers exchange worried glances. Has the king lost his mind? How can one defeat an army of 41-0 with 22-0 men? What these officers do not know, what the entire French army does not suspect, is that Frederick has already been preparing the most perfect trap in military history for 3 days. A trap so ingenious, so brutal in its execution, that in 90 minutes it will humiliate a superpower and change the course of the 7 Years' War forever. Today, they will witness the Battle of Rosbar, the battle in which an apparently defeated king turned the arrogance of his enemies into their greatest weakness. The battle that will prove that genius is more important than numbers, that strategy is more powerful than brute force. But before we dive into the 90-minute inferno, I must ask you for something. If you love stories about the most brilliant military minds in history, if you want to understand how one man made the impossible possible, then leave a like now and subscribe to this channel. For what you're about to experience is more than just a battle. It is a masterclass in strategy, deception, and ice-cold execution. The French army continues to march. They have no idea that every step leads them deeper into the abyss. Frederick gives a sign, and his army begins to apparently retreat. The trap is set, and the French have already snapped shut. To understand how Frederick the Great reached this desperate point, we must look back 7 years to a young king who inherited a throne and immediately took the most dangerous bet in European history. Frederick of Prussia was no ordinary monarch. Born, he grew up under the iron fist of his brutal father, who shaped him with blows and humiliations. While other princes played with wooden swords, Frederick studied philosophy, played the flute, and corresponded with Voltaire. His father called him a weakling. History would call him the Great. When he ascended the throne in 1740, Frederick inherited a small but perfectly organized kingdom. Prussia was no great power. It was an emerging state surrounded by giants. In the west lurked France, the most powerful nation in Europe. In the south ruled Austria, the centuries-old Habsburg Empire. In the east waited the expanding Russia, and in the north, Sweden held its position. Prussia was an island in an ocean of enemies, but Frederick had something his opponents underestimated: a mind sharp as a blade and the courage of a man who had nothing to lose. Within months of his coronation, he marched into Silesia, a rich Austrian province. It was a move of breathtaking boldness. The young Empress Maria Theresa of Austria would never forgive him this humiliation. And so the nightmare began. The wars over Silesia turned into something much bigger. The 7 Years' War, the first truly global conflict. But for Frederick, it was personal. It was his struggle for survival against a world that wanted to destroy him. By 1757, the most powerful coalition Europe had ever seen had formed. France, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and the Holy Roman Empire, all united with one single goal to wipe Prussia off the map and destroy Frederick. Imagine it, a small kingdom surrounded on all sides. Armies 10 times larger than his own marched in simultaneously. In the east, the Russians smashed his troops in the south, the Austrians pressed, and now, in the autumn of 1757, came the French army, Europe's proudest military power to deliver the death blow. Frederick had already won several battles, but every victory cost him men he could not replace. His army shrank, his resources dwindled, his allies doubted. Even his closest advisers whispered of capitulation. In the dark nights before Rosbach, Frederick wrote letters in which he openly spoke of suicide. He carried a poison capsule with him in case everything was lost. This was no presumptuous conqueror. This was a man on the brink who knew that the next battle would decide everything. But here is what is fascinating about Frederick. The more desperate his situation became, the sharper his mind became. Where others saw panic, he saw opportunities. Where others feared superiority, he recognized weaknesses. The French army under Soubise was huge, 41,000 of Europe's best soldiers. They had the Austrians as allies. They had artillery cavalry and the unbounded pride of a nation that considered itself invincible. As they marched through Saxony, they plundered villages and boasted in the taverns about the quick victory they would achieve. This arrogance, precisely this presumption, was the mistake Frederick had been waiting for. For a while, the French celebrated and already saw themselves as victors. Frederick was working on something they did not expect. He studied the terrain around Rosbach. He analyzed the march ropes. He observed how the French generals thought, how they moved, how their vanity influenced their decisions. And slowly, methodically, he began to construct the deadliest trap in military history. Here the question arises, what would you do if you were in Frederick's place? If you faced a fresh army with exhausted men, if the whole world was waiting for you to fail, would you fight or would you flee? Frederick chose a third option, an option so bold that only a genius or a madman would dare it. He would let them in. He would give them exactly what they wanted and then destroy them. November 1757. The situation for Prussia was not just serious, it was catastrophic. While Frederick gathered his small army at Rosbach, daily reports reached him that would have driven any other ruler to capitulation. In the east, a Russian army of 70,000 men had overrun the Prussian province of East Prussia. His troops there had been smashed. The Cossacks plundered and burned everything in their path. In the south, the Austrians under Field Marshal pressed towards Silesia, that province for which Frederick had risked everything. His garrisons held, but for how much longer? And now came the greatest threat. The Franco-Austrian army under the command of Charles de Rohan, Prince of Sub, and the Austrian general Joseph of Hilberg-Hausen. 41,000 men, fresh, well-equipped, full of certainty of victory. Soubise was no insignificant general. He was an aristocrat of the highest rank, a confidant of King Louis Seize, a man at home in the splendid halls of Versailles. For him, this campaign was more than just a military enterprise. It was an opportunity to increase his fame and humiliate the Prussian upstart. The French army had reason to be arrogant. France was the dominant land power in Europe. Their armies had shaped Europe for centuries. Their officers came from the noblest houses. Their soldiers wore the most magnificent uniforms. As the overconfident French army marched through Saxon territory, it was more a parade than a war march. The Prussian will run as soon as he sees us, boasted the French officers in their quarters. They drank wine, played cards, and already discussed how they would divide the spoils of victory. Berghaus, the Austrian commander, was more cautious. He knew Frederick's reputation. He knew that the Prussian king was unpredictable, that he had already won several battles he should have lost. But even Berg could not ignore the mathematics. 41 Zetadalas against 22 zeros, 0, almost 2 to 1. With such numbers, one could afford mistakes. What they did not know was that Frederick observed every one of their steps. Prussian scouts followed the French army every step of the way. They reported every movement, every camp, every march order. Frederick sat in his headquarters and studied the reports like a chess player, thinking 20 moves ahead. He noticed something decisive. The French army marched loosely without strict discipline. Their columns were long and cumbersome. Their cavalry rode ahead, separated from the infantry. Their artillery moved slowly and awkwardly. They were arrogant, and arrogance makes careless. Frederick's own army, on the other hand, was the opposite, 22 zeros, 0 men, but each one professional. The Prussian army was famous for its iron discipline, its precision, its ability to execute orders lightning fast. What they lacked in numbers, they made up for in coordination and speed, but even these advantages seemed not enough against such superiority. Frederick's generals gathered around him. The mood in the room was depressed. Some suggested retreating and preserving the army. "Your Majesty, if we lose this battle, Prussia is lost," argued one of them. "But if we retreat, we can fight another day." Frederick listened in silence, then stood up and went to the window. Outside, his soldiers were drilling in the cold November weather, exhausted, hungry, but still disciplined. "No," he said finally, "we do not retreat. We stay here and we will defeat them." "But how, Your Majesty?" asked a general desperately. Frederick turned around and something flashed in his eyes. Something dangerous, something brilliant by giving them what they want. "They expect us to run, so we will run, but not in the way they think." The generals looked at him confused. Frederick spread out the map on the table and began to explain. The terrain around Rossbach was hilly. There were gentle elevations that offered perfect cover. There were valleys in which troops could be hidden. And above all, there was a route that the French would take. Of that, Frederick was convinced. The French wanted to bypass the Prussian army, attack it from behind. That was the classic tactic, and precisely this predictability would be their downfall. "They will try to flank us," explained Frederick. "They will turn their entire army into a long march column to bypass our left flank, and in that moment, in exactly that moment, they will be vulnerable." The generals began to understand an army in march formation is no army in battle formation. It is a long snake, vulnerable, uncoordinated, unable to react quickly. "We let them march," Frederick continued. "We feign a retreat, and when they believe they have us, we strike with all force, with all speed, with surgical precision." One of the generals, an experienced veteran, smiled for the first time in days. "A trap, more than a trap?" Frederick corrected an annihilation, but for the plan to work, everything had to be perfect. Every detail, every timing, every movement. Frederick had only one chance, one single moment. If he struck too early, the French could form up. If he struck too late, they would recognize his true position. The timing had to be absolutely perfect. And so, the preparations began for what was to become the boldest military operation of the century. The night before the battle, Frederick's tent is lit by candle light. On the table lies a detailed map of the area around Rossbach. The king stands bent over it. His fingers trace the contours of the terrain, the possible march routes, the hidden positions. This is the moment when a desperate king becomes a military genius. Frederick had studied the terrain for 3 days. Every hill, every valley, every road was now as familiar to him as his own face, and he had recognized what others had overlooked. The landscape around Rossbach was not just a battlefield. It was a natural trap just waiting to be used. West of the Prussian position lay the Janis Hill and the Pilotzen Hill, 2 gentle elevations that offered perfect cover. Between them ran a flat valley. Exactly there, the French army would have to march if they tried to bypass the Prussian flank. And exactly there, Frederick would strike, but the plan was far more complex than just a simple ambush. It was a multi-stage masterpiece of deception and coordination. First phase, create the illusion. Frederick knew that the French would only walk into the trap if they believed the Prussians were vulnerable. So he had to show them exactly what they wanted to see: an army in dissolution, a king in panic, an opponent on the run. He ordered his troops to position themselves so that they appeared disorganized to French scouts, as if preparing for a hasty retreat. "Let them believe we're afraid," Frederick instructed his officers. "Let them think they have already won." Second phase, the hidden forces. While the French observed the apparently panicked Prussian army, Frederick secretly positioned his deadliest weapons behind the hills out of sight. From there, they could dominate the entire valley without being seen themselves. Frederick personally chose every angle, every position. The guns were aligned to the exact route the French army would take, but the true jewel in Frederick's plan was General Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz and his cavalry. Sids was 37 years old and already a legend. He had turned the Prussian cavalry into a precision weapon. Fast, disciplined, and absolutely deadly, he instinctively understood Frederick's vision. He knew what was required of him. 38 squadrons of cavalry, about 50 riders, were hidden behind Pelzen Hill. There they waited in absolute silence. The horses were trained to stay calm, no neighing. Third phase, the timing. This was the trickiest part of the entire plan. Everything depended on perfect timing. Frederick had to wait until the French army was fully committed, until they had completely dissolved their battle formation to march, until they were as vulnerable as a snake shedding its skin. Striking too early would mean they could form up. Striking too late would mean they would have surrounded the Prussian position. The moment had to be absolutely precise. Frederick placed observers on every hill. Each had clear instructions: report every movement of the French army, every change in their formation, every indication of their intentions. Fourth phase, psychological warfare. But Frederick also knew that the plan would only work if he understood the psychology of his opponents. And he did. Sub was vain. If so pressed for attack, he would give in. The French soldiers themselves were convinced of their superiority. They had underestimated the Prussian army. They saw 22,000 men and thought it would be an easy victory. Frederick planned to turn this arrogance into their downfall. The night before the battle, Frederick called his commanders to a final meeting. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but penetrating, "tomorrow we will do something the French do not expect. We will not give them the battle they expect. We will give them the battle we choose." He explained the plan again, step by step. Every officer knew exactly what the battle unfolds. Prussia's tactics in action was expected of him. The infantry would hold formation, ready to maneuver lightning fast. The artillery would remain silent until the perfect moment came. The cavalry would wait no matter how long it took. Discipline, Frederick emphasized, will decide this battle. Not courage alone, not numbers, but discipline, precision, and timing. The officers nodded. They understood they were Prussians. Discipline was their religion. And one more thing, Frederick added. His eyes sparkled in the flickering candle light. "When we strike tomorrow, we strike with absolute force. No restraint, no mercy. We destroy them completely. We give them a lesson that all of Europe will hear." The commanders left the tent. Outside, the Prussian army prepared in the darkness. Soldiers checked their weapons. Cavalrymen groomed their horses. Artillerymen calculated firing angles. Frederick stood alone in his tent and looked at the map. Everything was prepared, every detail considered, every contingency planned. But he also knew no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Something would go wrong. Something unforeseen would happen. And in that moment, He would have to improvise. In that moment, his genius would truly be tested. He lay down on his camp bed, but sleep did not come. His mind played the battle over and over. Variations, possibilities, risks. Outside dawn began, November 5th, 1757. The day Frederick the Great would spring the most perfect trap in military history. The French awoke in their camps. They just didn't know it yet. November 1757, 11:00 a.m. The French army awakens with the confidence of men who have already won before the first shot is fired. Soldiers clean their uniforms as if going to a parade, not into battle. Size and Hildburgh's hen study their maps. They will make a wide arc west and then north with their entire army to bypass the Prussian left flank. A classic envelopment maneuver with 41. It is an impressive sight, like a huge snake winding through the Saxon landscape as if fleeing before the French superiority. The French observers see this and immediately report subbies. The Prussians are retreating. They are afraid. In the French command center, jubilation breaks out. "I knew it," cries subbies. "The Prussian is running." Accelerate the march. We must not let him escape. Exactly this reaction Frederick had wanted. The French army accelerates its march. The columns become even longer, even thinner, even more vulnerable. Discipline relaxes. Soldiers chat with each other, convinced that the battle is already won before it has begun. They march straight into the valley between Janus Hill and Pelzen Hill. Behind these hills wait 5,000 Prussian cavalrymen in absolute silence. The horses are calm. The men hold their breath. Cid sits on his horse, hand on the saber grip, eyes fixed on the hill crest, waiting for the signal. Frederick observes through his telescope, counts the French regiments passing by, waits, not yet, not yet. The French march column is now stretched over more than 3 km. Their formation is chaotic. The front units are far separated from the rear. The artillery lags behind. 12:00. Frederick lowers his telescope. Now a single signal shot breaks the silence. Seydlitz hears it. He raises his saber. Prussians form up as if by magic. The waiting mass transforms into a perfect cavalry formation. 38 squadrons, 5,000 riders in impeccable order. Forward, the Prussian cavalry explodes over the hillrest like a tidal wave of steel and horse flesh. The French, still marching in their long column, first hear the thunder, a deep rhythmic rumbling that makes the earth shake. They turn around. What they see freezes their blood. A wall of Prussian cavalrymen charges toward them, perfectly formed at full gallop, sabers drawn. An unstoppable avalanche of death and destruction. Cavalry form up, form up. The French officers scream desperately, but it is too late. Far too late. You cannot transform an army in march formation into battle formation in seconds. The French soldiers stumble over each other. Horses crash into infantrymen. Sabers flash in the sunlight. Men scream. Blood splashes on the frozen ground. The Prussian cavalry is not just fast, it is precise. Years of training have turned them into a perfect war machine. They strike, withdraw, reform, and strike again. The French column shatters like glass on stone. But Cid, it is not finished yet. He leads his cavalry in a wide curve and attacks again, this time from another side, and then again and again. The French cavalry tries to counter, but it is completely disorganized. Some units try heroically to form up, but Prussian precision crushes every attempt at resistance. Within 30 minutes, the entire French flank is in complete chaos, while Cid decimates the French cavalry and infantry. Frederick gives the next order: artillery fire. Suddenly, 18 heavy Prussian cannons appear on the crest of Janus Hill. They had been waiting there the whole time, perfectly positioned, their barrels aimed at the valley where the French army now finds itself in panicked chaos. The first salvo thunders out. Cannonballs plow through the densely packed French formations. Each ball kills or maims several men. At this distance, and against such densely packed targets, the Prussian artillery cannot miss. Boom. Boom, boom, the cannons fire in deadly rhythm. The Prussian artillerymen are the best in Europe. They load, aim, and fire with machine-like efficiency. The French army is now under double attack. Saditz's cavalry tears apart their flanks, while Frederick's artillery destroys their center. French officers desperately try to rally their troops. Form up, fight back, they roar. But how can one fight an enemy who is everywhere and nowhere? Cavalry strikes and disappears. The artillery thunders from the hills, unreachable for counter-fire. Some French units try to storm the hills to reach the Prussian cannons. The scene is apocalyptic. The ground is littered with dead and wounded. Horses run leaderless. Flags lie in the dirt. Officers who an hour ago spoke of quick victory now lie lifeless in the grass. And now, as if the horror were not enough, the Prussian infantry appears. Frederick had kept them in reserve the whole time, perfectly formed, waiting for this exact moment. Now they march forward, not in panic, not in haste, but in that ice-cold Prussian discipline that made them famous. Twice as fast as any other army in Europe, they fire in waves, an uninterrupted wall of lead. French soldiers fall like wheat before the scythe. What was left of the French battle formation now breaks completely. Units begin to flee. First individual soldiers, then whole companies, finally whole regiments. The flight becomes a stampede. Soubise desperately tries to rally his army, but it is hopeless. His orders are not heard in the chaos. His officers are dead or fled. His proud army no longer exists as a coherent fighting unit. At 1:30 p.m., only 90 minutes after the battle began, it is all over. Franco Austrian army that entered this battle with 41,000 men is annihilated, not just defeated, annihilated. 5,000 French soldiers lie dead or wounded on the battlefield. Another 5,000 are in panicked flight and are pursued and cut down by the Prussian cavalry over kilometers. Prussian losses 568 men. The sun sinks over the battlefield of Rosbach, and the true extent of the catastrophe becomes visible. The valley through which the proud French army had marched just hours ago is now a cemetery. Thousands of corpses lie scattered over the frozen earth. Wounded soldiers groan into the shock and aftermath cold. Horse carcasses lie between broken cannons and abandoned weapons. The Prussian soldiers move methodically over the battlefield. They collect weapons, countless weapons and supplies. The officer pauses almost incredulous at the next words. Our losses, Your Majesty, 365 dead, 180 wounded. Total 568 men. Frederick lets these numbers sink in. 41,000 against 22,000, and in the end 5,000 French losses against 568 Prussian, almost 1,001. This was not just a victory, it was a demonstration of absolute military superiority. The captured French soldiers are rounded up. Now they stare at the ground with empty eyes. Among the prisoners are also high-ranking officers. A French general is brought before Frederick. The man is wounded, his magnificent uniform torn and stained with blood. Frederick regards him with an impenetrable gaze. Where is Soubise fled? Men like Soubise always flee first. Make sure the prisoners are treated decently. Frederick orders his officers. They are soldiers, not criminals. Give them food and medical care. This gesture of mercy is not only humanity, it is also strategy. Frederick knows that these captured soldiers will return to France, and there they will tell not only of their defeat, but also of the honor with which they were treated. The news of the catastrophe reaches the fleeing remnants of the French army that same night. Soub, who has sought refuge in a small village, can hardly comprehend what has happened. In the morning he commanded 41,000 men. Now only hours later, perhaps 20,000 remain, and even these are completely demoralized, disorganized, unable to fight. He desperately writes a letter to Versailles, but what should he say? How does one explain such humiliation? We were overwhelmed, he finally writes. The enemy attacked with unexpected speed. The losses are considerable. Considerable, a euphemism for a catastrophe of biblical proportions. While Soubise composes his humiliating report, Frederick is already preparing his next move. He knows that this battle is only part of the larger war. The Austrians in the south are still a threat. The Russians in the east too. But he has gained something more important than just a tactical victory. He has shown the world that Prussia is not only viable, but dangerous. The news of Rossbach spreads through Europe at breathtaking speed. In Vienna, Maria Terzer receives the news 3 days later. She is furious not at Frederick but at Soubise and the French. Incompetent fools, Petersburg Tsarina, Elizabeth reads the report with growing concern. She had hoped the French would finish Frederick. Now she has to realize that the Prussian king is more dangerous than ever. In London, on the other hand, the news is received with jubilation. Great Britain is Prussia's only ally in this war, and Frederick's victory strengthens their common position. Numbers mean nothing without organization. An army of 40,000 poorly trained soldiers is weaker than 20,000 perfectly trained warriors. The Prussian army under Frederick was a precision machine. Every soldier knew exactly what was expected of him. The infantry could execute complex maneuvers in minutes that took other armies hours. The cavalry moved like a single organism. The artillery fired with deadly accuracy. This discipline was the result of endless training. Prussian soldiers drilled daily for hours until every movement became second nature. The famous Prussian rate of fire, 3 to 4 volleys per minute, was no innate ability. It was the product of thousands of practice hours. In contrast, the French army, despite its size, was poorly coordinated. The different regiments had different training standards. The Austrian allies used different tactics. When the battle became chaotic, this lack of coordination broke the entire army. The lesson in quality beats quantity. A small, perfectly trained unit is more valuable than a large, poorly organized mass. Third pillar, the art of deception. Sun Tzu wrote 2,000 years ago. All warfare is based on deception. Frederick proved this truth at Rossbach. The entire battle was a deception. The apparent retreat, the visible weakness, the hidden forces behind the hills. Everything was designed to lull the enemy into security and then destroy him. But Frederick's deception was not crude. It was subtle, convincing, based on what the enemy already wanted to believe. The French wanted to believe the Prussians were weak. So Frederick showed them weakness, and they never saw the blade waiting behind his back. This kind of deception requires deep understanding. Whoever controls what others believe controls the outcome. Fourth pillar, mastery of the terrain. Frederick spent 3 days studying every hill, every valley, every possible path around Rossbach. This preparation was crucial. He knew exactly where he could hide his cavalry. He knew the perfect position for his artillery. He understood which route the French would take and why. The terrain was his ally. The hills provided cover. The valleys channeled the enemy movement. The open areas became killing zones. In modern warfare, this is called battlefield preparation. But the principle applies to any competition. Whoever masters his terrain, whether physical, intellectual, or strategic, has a massive advantage. Frederick did not fight on a random battlefield. He carefully chose his ground and prepared it. When the battle began, the field itself was his weapon. Fifth pillar, perfect timing. Perhaps the most brilliant element of Rossbach was Frederick's timing. He waited until the French army was fully committed, until they had completely dissolved their battle formation and were in a long, vulnerable march column, until they had advanced so far that retreat was impossible. Only then did he strike. Attacking too early would have given the French time to form up. Attacking too late would have meant they would have reached his position. The timing had to be absolutely precise. This kind of timing requires nerves of steel. Frederick had to watch a huge enemy army come closer and still wait. Every one of his officers was nervous, but Frederick waited until the perfect moment came. In the business world, in negotiations, sixth pillar, the coordination of all arms. Rosbach was no simple attack. It was a symphony of destruction. First the cavalry struck, fast, brutal, destabilizing. It shattered the enemy formation and created chaos. Then the artillery opened fire, systematically deadly, unstoppable. It destroyed organized attempts at resistance. Finally came the infantry, disciplined, precise, merciless. It delivered the coup de grace. Each arm played its role at the perfect time. The cavalry created the chaos. The artillery exploited it. The infantry finished it. This coordination was the result of years of joint training. Frederick's army drilled not only as individual units, but as an integrated system. They understood how each component interacted with the others. In the modern world, we see this principle in successful organizations, marketing, production, sales. Everything must be coordinated. A brilliant product without marketing fails. Brilliant marketing without a good product also fails. Only the integration of all elements leads to triumph. Seventh pillar, the exploitation of the opponent's mistake. The French made a catastrophic mistake. They dissolved their battle formation to march. A more competent general would have sent an advanced guard ahead. He would have organized flank protection. He would have ensured the army could form up quickly at any time. Sub did none of that. He was so convinced of his numerical advantage that he ignored basic precautions. Frederick recognized this mistake immediately and exploited it with deadly efficiency. The lesson: wait for your opponent's 50-0-0, the end of French supremacy mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. The difference between a good and a great strategist is the ability to recognize and exploit these mistakes before the opponent can correct them. The synthesis Rosbach was brilliant because it combined all these elements: psychological understanding, superior discipline, masterful deception, perfect use of terrain, precise timing, seamless coordination, and the merciless exploitation of enemy mistakes. Remove just one element, and the battle could have turned out differently. Together, they created military perfection. The true genius lay not in individual tactical moves, but in the orchestration of the whole, like a composer arranging every note, every rhythm, every pause to create a masterpiece. Frederick the Great was that composer, and Rosbach was his symphony. Rosbach was more than just a battle. It was a turning point, a moment that changed the entire course of the 7 Years' War, the immediate impact on the coalition. In the weeks after Rosbach, the anti-Prussian coalition began to crumble, not physically, but psychologically. France, humiliated and demoralized, withdrew the bulk of its troops from the German theater. The Grand Army, one of the nation's pride, was destroyed as an effective fighting force. Louis lost interest in this continental adventure. France's focus shifted to the colonial war against Great Britain, a war they would also lose. The French absence meant that Austria now had to fight Prussia alone without the powerful ally in the West. Russia, although still at war, became more hesitant. Xena Elizabeth had seen what happened to the invincible French army. If Frederick could annihilate 40-0 French in 90 minutes, what could he do against Russian armies? The Russian generals became more cautious, more defensive. They marched slower, attacked less often, avoided risky confrontations. The psychological shock, but the most important effect of Rosbach was psychological. Before Rosbach, Prussia was considered brave, but ultimately doomed to failure. It was only a matter of time before the coalition's superiority crushed the small kingdom. After Rosbach, this perception changed fundamentally. Suddenly, Prussia was no longer the underdog fighting for survival. It was a military power to be feared. Frederick was no longer just a brave king. He was a military genius, perhaps the greatest general of his time. This change in perception had real consequences. Smaller German states that had sympathized with the coalition became neutral or even switched sides. Diplomatic negotiations began to shift in Prussia's favor. In the capitals of Europe, people began to take Prussia seriously, not as a temporary anomaly, but as a permanent power on the continent. The strategic breathing space, Rosbach gave Frederick something he desperately needed: time. With the French threat neutralized in the west, he could concentrate his forces on the Austrians in the south. Just 1 month after Rosbach, he would fight another brilliant battle at Lithen, where he defeated an Austrian army of 60,000 men with 33,000. These two victories, Rosbach and Lithen, in such quick succession, saved Prussia from certain downfall. Without Rosbach, Frederick would have been forced to fight on two fronts simultaneously, in the west against the French, in the south against the Austrians. An impossible situation. Rosbach eliminated one of these fronts and gave him the operational flexibility he needed to survive. The change in the dynamics of war. After Rosbach, the nature of the war changed. The coalition powers became more defensive. They avoided large field battles against Frederick. Instead, they concentrated on sieges on exhausting Prussian resources, on a long war of attrition. This was actually a smarter strategy. Prussia was small, its resources limited. A long war would bleed the kingdom dry, even if Frederick won every battle. And indeed, although Frederick continued to win brilliant tactical victories, he could not stop Prussia's strategic decline. His army shrank year after year. His economy collapsed. His population suffered. Rosbach won the battle and saved Prussia from immediate annihilation. But it could not prevent the long creeping death struggle, the salvation by chance. Ironically, Prussia was ultimately not saved by military genius, but by a fluke of history. In 1762, Tsarina Elizabeth of Russia died. Her successor, Peter Roman III, was a fervent admirer of Frederick. One of his first official acts was to withdraw Russia from the coalition and even offer an alliance with Prussia. This miracle of the House of Brandenburg, as it was called, changed everything. Without Russia, the coalition no longer had the strength to continue the war. In 1763, the 7 Years' War ended with the Peace of Hubertusburg. The military legacy of Rosbach became the gold standard of military training. In militaries from West Point to Sandhurst, the battle is still studied. Officers analyze Frederick's deception, maneuvers, his timing, his coordination of different arms. They learn how to exploit psychological weaknesses, how to use terrain as an ally, how to win with less against more. The Prussian, later German military tradition was shaped by Rosbach. The emphasis on discipline, on speed, on the center of gravity, the decisive point of attack. All of this can be traced back to Frederick's innovations. Clausewitz, the great military theorist, studied Frederick's campaigns intensively. His concepts of the fog of war and friction were partly developed through the analysis of battles like Rosbach. In the Second World War, German generals like G. Darien and Manstein studied Frederick's tactics. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, fast coordinated attacks that surprise and disorganize the enemy, is a direct descendant of the principles Frederick demonstrated at Rosbach. But this connection is double-edged. The same principles that enabled brilliant defensive battles were later misused for wars of aggression. The legacy of Rosbach is complex and sometimes dark. The personal dimension, who was Frederick after Rosbach? The battle changed him. We can admire his military brilliance without glorifying his wars. We can learn from his strategic lessons without imitating his militarism. The timeless question. In the end, Rosbach poses us a timeless question. What makes greatness? Is it the ability to win at any cost? Is it brilliant strategy, even if it brings death and destruction? Is it survival against all odds, even if survival itself is questionable? Frederick the Great won at Rosbach. He saved his kingdom. He secured his place in history, but was that great? Perhaps true greatness is more complex. Perhaps it requires not only brilliant tactics, but also moral judgment. Not only the ability to win, but also the wisdom to know when the fight is worth it. The final lesson. If we should take one lesson from Rosbach, it is this: genius alone is not enough. Frederick was a genius. There is no doubt about that, but his genius was put in the service of endless wars. He won battles but ruined his country. He became the great but died lonely and embited. True greatness requires more than just brilliant strategy. It requires wisdom. It requires the understanding that the greatest victory sometimes lies in not fighting. That the most brilliant tactic is sometimes diplomacy, not war. Rosbach shows us what a human mind at the peak of its tactical abilities can achieve. 90 minutes that changed history, a perfect symphony of deception, timing, and violence, but it also shows us the limits of pure tactics. Frederick won the battle, but in the end won the war only by chance. His kingdom survived, but at a terrible price. Study Rosbach, learn from Frederick, admire his brilliance, but never forget. The greatest triumphs are not those won on battlefields, but those that make battlefields unnecessary. And now it is up to you, dear viewers, who was the greatest military strategist in history for you? Was it Frederick with his calculated genius, Alexander with his bold, daring Napoleon with his revolutionary vision, Hannibal with his unimaginable endurance? Write it in the comments. Discuss, debate. And if you want to see more stories about brilliant strategists, about decisive battles, about moments that change the world, then don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell. For history is not just what was. History is the lesson for what is to come. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and never forget. True greatness lies not in victory, but in the wisdom to know what is worth fighting